the radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this, Monday night. So let me start by apologizing. I'd promised some shows on Saturday and Sunday, and I had all the best of intentions, but I got really sick in Atlanta. I got wiped out, some kind of flu bug that I probably brought from Asia. I had a fever. I was in bed 14 hours. I still managed to give a talk on Friday at the FECON at Foundation for Economic Education in front of lots of students, a packed room, but I was just out of it the whole of Saturday, whole of Sunday. So I just couldn't do it. I'm feeling much better today, almost back to normal. I hope to be back to normal tomorrow because I start traveling again on Wednesday. I'm gone for a month, 4 weeks, and we'll see how many shows I'll be able to do during those 4 weeks. But what can I tell you? Next year is going to be better because next year I'm staying home more, and we're going to do more shows, and we're going to have a lot more opportunities to interact. So that's going to be cool. But so far, I'd say through the end of September is going to be tough. So anyway, I'm glad to be standing. For a while there, I wasn't sure I was going to be able to be standing. I was like, I usually don't have to spend time in bed when I'm sick. I'm usually a little sick. This just floored me. Anyway, it's over. I'm not. I'm almost recovered. So that is good. That is good news. All right, today I want to talk about a topic that I think has probably gone underreported and under your radar, and under most people's radar, because I think it's kind of an internal squabble, if you mean, but I think it's more than a squabble. An internal fight, a major internal fight within the conservative intellectual movement. So this is not even among, I think, the intellectuals out there, although they're affected by it, they will be affected out. It's happening, but what is happening right now among the intellectuals within the conservative movement is they are going after one another. There really is kind of a civil war going on. And it is dramatic, and it is important. And, we always knew this would happen, and we'll get to all of that in a minute. We always knew this would happen, but who exactly wins this civil war, how it all comes out, is going to, a large extent, determine the fate of this country, because they are going to be the dominant force in at least one political party, and the political party of the right, and they are going to determine the fate of the right, potentially for generations, but certainly for the next couple of generations. So the conservatives are really going after it, and I think at the end of the day, this is a direct consequence of the Trump presidency. We'll see how, and they say it's a direct consequence of the Trump presidency. And this is the sense in which, I'm going to say over time why Trump is such a bad president. That the damage he will do to the politics of this country, to the realm of ideas, to the scope of ideas, to the range of ideas that is acceptable in this country. That is going to be, to a large extent, a significant part of the damage he does. Beyond tax increases, tax decreases, deregulation, tariffs, all that stuff, which to some extent, it's very damaging, and most of it is very damaging and bad, particularly the reasons for doing it. But this is actually going to be worse. This is actually going to be worse in terms of what is going on here. So bear with me today, because this is not maybe the sexiest topics in the world, But I do think it's one of the most important topics that we will cover on this show, and I think it's directly related to the future of this country and important. So bear with me as we go through some of this. We're going to do some history. I'm going to read you from some of the opposing parties in this, and you know, it's something that I came across somewhat by accident. I read a column by Jonah Goldberg, who I read once in a while at the National Review. I don't usually do anything with the National Review because of its history with Ayn Rand and the way it treated Atlas Shrugged and Ayn Rand. But in this case, the National Review is center here. The National Review, if you can believe it, are the good guys, relatively speaking. And so we're going to go through who's being attacked by whom, what are the arguments, why are these arguments being made, and what I think the consequences of this for the conservative movement and ultimately for the American people. I'll take Super Chat questions on the topic. So if the Super Chat question is about conservatism and this particular conflict, or the history of conservatism, or its attitude towards Ayn Rand, or anything like that, then I will take your questions with regard to it. But let's leave any questions unrelated to the particular topic we're talking about today to the end of the show. All right, the end of the show. All right, let's jump into it. Just one more comment, setup, if you will, that we need to make before we jump into this completely. I'm going to use liberal in its classical sense of the word. So I'm going to use liberal in the sense of classical liberal. That is, in the sense that it meant in the 19th century, still to some extent means it in Latin America and in Europe. It means people who promoted individualism, who promoted individual liberty, individual freedom, who, you know, were not consistent promoters of laissez-faire capitalism, certainly weren't laissez-faire capitalism, but liberals who generally fell on the political spectrum on the side of individualism, on the side of freedom, on the side of capitalism. That's the sense in which liberals has traditionally been used, and you know, part of the discussion here is about liberal values. Liberal values being liberal, again, not in the sense of leftists today. Liberal values meaning pro-liberty, the defenders of particularly individual liberty. Another way in which they phrase it is individual autonomy. Individual autonomy. So that's the sense in which I'm going to use liberal here. So please don't then say I become a leftist promoting, leftist liberalism. This is kind of the liberalism as it was used. I mean, liberalism is probably one of the worst words that America, at least, allowed the left to capture, dominate, and take over. So the long list of words, some of them more important than liberal, but liberal in the realm of politics is one of those good words that should still be owned by those of us who advocate for individual rights, and unfortunately is not. So I don't call like the left liberals. They don't deserve it. They do not deserve it. I call them leftists. I don't call them progressives. They don't deserve that word. They're not for progress. I only call them progressives when describing the progressive movement of the late 19th century, early 20th century in the United States. But the left are leftists. Everybody knows what that means. Or statists or collectivists, which is probably particularly collectivist, more accurate in terms of what they particularly have. So that's what I mean by liberal. All right. So let's talk about a little bit about the history of the conservative movement. Now, in particular, certainly the modern conservative movement. I don't want to go all the way back to Brooke, the British conservative. I want to talk about American modern conservative movement, kind of the post-Buckley, 60s, 70s, kind of Reagan coalition that really has come, that for a long time seemed to create political victories, significant political victories for the Republican Party. Now, again, you have to differentiate between the Republican Party, conservatives, people out there who call themselves conservatives, and then conservative intellectuals. The spat, the fight, the Civil War that we're going to be talking about right now is more in line with the conservative intellectuals. Okay. Capitalist Nick asks, who are conservatives' brightest young stars? I will be talking about them. Now, I wouldn't call them, stars, but because, as you'll see, I think they are bad guys, and I don't like any conservatives in that sense. Jonah Goldberg is probably the one I like the most, but even he has real problems, and I'll try to quote a few things out of his article as well to show you that. But we're going to focus on. So let's talk about the history of conservatives a little bit. So this is really the history going back to William F. Buckley, and this is going to be a very short version because I don't want this to be about the history. But basically, the idea was that the conservatives came together in the 1960s and 70s and created a coalition of varied people with varied interests. They generally were all religious. Religious had to be and was an important part of what it meant to be a conservative. But you could be religious at a variety of different levels, from super committed evangelical to super committed Catholic to super committed whatever, or even a Jew. But you had to be, or you could be Jewish, but you had to be committed to religion. Atheists were not invited to the conservative coalition. And indeed, William F. Buckley did his utmost to rid the conservative movement of what he thought of as objectivist influences. He did what he could to get rid of Ayn Rand, not that she was part of it, but to distance himself as much as he could. With that review of Atlas Shrugged in the National Review, the most horrific review of Atlas Shrugged published by anybody, he did his best to kind of to hide him, to distance him, the conservative movement from Ayn Rand. But he tried to create a coalition of people who took religion seriously at varying degrees. A coalition of people who call them liberal conservatives, who thought that individual liberty was important, that in morality, religion was everything, that government should not overemphasize morality. It should do certain things like ban abortion. They would still be against, let's say, gay marriage. But generally, government should have a light hand when it comes to social issues. Social issues should be primarily fought at the cultural level. And that generally, economic-wise, government should have hands-on. So the government should be relatively free market. Not completely free market. They're not laissez-faire. They're not capitalists all the way, but relatively free market. So less government intervention in the economy, right? And again, so that was one wing. They were the most free market wing. Then you had, neoconservatives who thought it was important to have religion, even though they weren't very religious. Government should be very involved in foreign policy and bringing democracy to the world. Government should be hands-off on economics, and except when it achieved some kind of greater good, and so on. And then you had paleo-conservatives who thought we should not intervene overseas, but who thought that the government should be much more heavy-handed domestically, should be much more nationalist, should be much more focused on preserving American jobs, building walls, and generally had a much more nationalistic rhetoric, and also believed that the government should have a much heavier hand, both economically and a much heavier hand when it came to social issues. So the battle on social issues, they believe, was not just a cultural battle. It was much more of a political battle. And there were a variety of other conservatives, all kinds. And the fact is that the conservative intellectual movement, as compared to the conservative movement, the conservative intellectual movement was primarily dominated by Catholics and Jews, mainly Catholics and some Jews. Buckley was a Catholic, but Catholics have always been at the intellectual forefront of the conservative movement. Jews have been there. The few Jews that happen to be conservative, not that many of them are. There's Commentary Magazine and the neoconservatives, Irving Kristol, his son, and other neoconservatives. Buchanan, of course, was paleo. His was a relatively small wing on the intellectual side, although it had vast public support as his presidential bid. I can't remember which year. He did pretty well in the primaries for somebody who had very little of a network and very little of an effort. He was a TV, commentator. That was his thing. Brandon, you're asking a question that's a little bit out of the topic of what I'm covering. I will get to it, but much later. So it's related, but not really related. I want questions now. The questions I'll take now are really about conservatism, conservative movement, related somehow to conservatism. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy paste your question so that I do get to it in a little while. All right. So, all right. 1 second. Yep. So it was this coalition of Soviet Union haters, like defense hawks, who didn't care that much about the economy. People who cared about the economy didn't care about foreign policy. A whole mishmash of people who wanted more government intervention or less government intervention in the economy, more government intervention, less government intervention on social issues. But what unified them all is clearly, the one thing that was a clearly common denominator was religion and its importance. It's important not only in one's personal life, but in the public square, as they would say it. The idea that religion played a huge role in the moral character of a people and a huge role in how one should govern. And that social issues, abortion, gay rights, things like that, were of vast importance and needed to be held back and needed to be, the left needed to be controlled, held back on these issues. And that kind of created this big tent of conservatism. They called it, the conservatives themselves, call it fusionism. A fusion of all these different brands of what they call the different brands of conservatism. A fusionism. Another aspect that dominated this fusionism, and you can certainly see in Ronald Reagan's rhetoric, and in the rhetoric of many of the leading conservatives of the period, was a certain respect for the Founding Fathers and a certain understanding of the Founding Fathers in the context of, I'd say, individualism. So a certain, maybe grudgingly, but a certain respect for individualism, for what they call individual autonomy, for the rights of individual Americans to make individual choices, for you to be an atheist, for you to be gay. It's just the state shouldn't recognize you. So there's a certain grudging acceptance of that individualism. And you can certainly see that in Goldwater. Now, what is Goldwater conservatism? Goldwater conservatism is part of this big tent, although I think the Goldwater conservatives shrunk over time and almost disappeared. It was a strong stance on national defense, so that there were many of. It was the most laissez-faire of all the conservative views of the economy, so the most laissez-faire of the conservatives. That part shrunk over time, fewer and fewer real free marketers in that world. But a recognition that he shared with all other conservatives that the only way to make a moral defense of capitalism was through religion, was to use religion in order to do that. And understanding that religion played a major, major part in conservatism and in the governing of America, that religion was important, even though Goldwater was very tolerant, you could say, and it ultimately was pro-abortion and pro-gays and all of these things that somewhat separated him. So he became called as more of a libertarian conservative, and there are libertarian conservatives. Some of them are still around. You know, when I speak in front of libertarian groups, I often get the libertarians who are really conservatives, and the conservatives on social issues because they're very religious, and they believe the state has a role there. So, you know, I think the free market part of Goldwater became less and less influential in the conservative movement, and he became less and less religious in terms of his willingness to use government to impose religion on the people over time. But there aren't any Goldwater Republicans anymore, as far as I can tell. But that was the fusionism that existed. Over the last, 5, 6, 7 years, you've basically gotten, I think, 3 major parts of this around today and thrive. And you can see this, I'd say, particularly since Donald Trump. So what I'll call, the illiberal conservatives, the Pat Buchanan, paleo, the people who want to use religion and who are willing to intervene in the economy and who place the social public good at the forefront of everything and want to minimize the idea of individualism. They are one party within the conservative movement, and a party that has been massively emboldened by Donald Trump. And we'll talk about that. Massively emboldened by Donald Trump. 2 other parts of the conservative intellectual movement. One focused around the National Review, and the other focused around Commentary magazine. I think have both shrunk in power post-Trump and are now, I think, on the verge of being, the attempt is to basically eviscerate them, to kick them out of the conservative movement. The kind of National Review, they're not free marketers, but they tend to believe in individual liberty to some extent. They're anti-abortion, and they're kind of, and they're anti-gay rights, but they're tolerant of the fact that gays have won the ability to get married, and they're willing to leave that alone. And it's not that important to them, and they want to convince people. So their primary way of changing the world from the abortion perspective, from the gay rights perspective, is debate. It's to try to convince the culture that these ideas are wrong. It's to try to convince the culture that they need a change, that they need to change. And they try to use arguments, and they don't like Donald Trump. They don't like Donald Trump because they think he's a thug, because they think he represents all the character flaws that they've always attacked and have always thought, from a Christian perspective, that a president shouldn't have, that they've always thought they represent more of what the left has. And they don't like him economically because of his interventionist and his interference. They're generally, softly pro-immigration, and now make the big distinction between illegal and legal immigration, but they're generally vaguely pro-immigration. They're generally vaguely pro-trade. And some of them at least, were certainly never Trumpers. Then there was another guy. There's another group called the Neoconservatives around Commentary Magazine. And I would characterize them as very similar. They tend to be Jewish rather than Christian. They tend to be more focused on foreign policy and more interventionist foreign policy than the National Review. But both of these wings of the conservative movements have been shrinking. And Donald Trump has become more powerful, as Donald Trump has become more significant. Somebody mentioned the Weekly Standard. The Weekly Standard was neoconservatism. And one of the, I think, signs of the shrinking influence of the neocons is the closing of the Weekly Standard. The Weekly Standard used to be an unbelievably popular magazine. I don't think it ever made money, but most of these magazines don't make money. But the fact that it closed was a sign of the shrinking influence of neoconservatism. And of course, I co-authored a book, Neoconservatism: An Obituary to an Idea. I don't know, 6-7 years ago with Dr. Brad Thompson. And so I'm no fan of the neocons, but I have to say, as compared to some of these people who are going to win this battle, the neocons would be a huge step forward. Okay, so a few months ago, First Things. Now, First Things is a magazine that is run by devout Catholics, conservative Catholics, as compared to liberal Catholics, very intellectual, conservative, philosophical, conservative Catholics, many of them Thomists. And First Things has always been a very respected magazine within the conservative movement. It's the first guy who founded it, Niehaus, I think his name was affiliated in one way or another with the neoconservatives, or at least it was somebody the neoconservatives definitely respected a lot. But anyway, a few months ago, the First Things published an article called Against the Dead Consensus, signed by about 10, 12, I haven't counted, intellectuals on the right, Catholic intellectuals on the right. And this is, by the way, why I don't consider myself on the right because of this, right? Because these are the people on the right. I'm not on the right if these people are on the right. Basically what they're saying is the world has changed. Donald Trump's election has changed the world, and it will never be the same again. Jennifer is asking, are they populist type conservatives? You'll see, not on the intellectual side, but they embrace populism as a means to power, and we'll get to that. They say, I'm quoting them, there's no return to the pre-Trump conservative consensus. This is the fusionism that collapsed in 2016. Remember that magazines like the National Review, my belief is even First Things, suddenly Commentary Magazine, the Weekly Standard, all supported different candidates, all supported candidates other than Donald Trump. In a sense, the intellectuals were brushed aside, and Donald Trump was elected in spite of conservative intellectual opposition in the primaries. And then, of course, in the general election, there was this massive split between the conservative intellectuals who were never Trumpers and the rest who went on the bandwagon, some grudgingly, but many ultimately became huge supporters of Trump. And this is the group attacking the National Review. So what are they saying? Forget this. They say the problem is that this consensus among conservatism was always bad. It was always wrong. Even in the Cold War, you could see the real problem with this coalition. He writes, or they write, but even during the Cold War, this conservatism was too often tracked the same lodestar liberalism did, namely individual autonomy, the fetishization of autonomy, call it individualism, paradoxically yielded the very tyranny that consensus conservatives claim most to detest. So what is the issue here? Because the conservatives embraced individual autonomy and the left embraced individual autonomy. They ceded individual autonomy to the left, and to the way they see it, individualism means following your whim. Individualism means doing whatever you feel like. Individualism means complete nihilism, hedonism, the whole modern leftist movement. That, they say, is a consequence of valuing the individual, of valuing individual preferences, of valuing individual autonomy. And they say what you get from that is abortion, legal. What you get from that is gay marriage. And what you get from that is what's going on campuses today. And the problem with you conservatives, they are saying, the problem with you conservatives was you bought into this individualism. You bought into individual autonomy. No separation of the whim-worshipping, thuggy collectivists that are the left. No separation of that from real individualism, from the individualism of the founding fathers, never mind the individualism of a post-Ayn Rand world. No. Any focus on the individualism and individualism's ability, freedom to express himself, to live his life as he sees fits, that is all bad. And that's been fetishized. And by doing that, you have sanctioned the left, allowed the left to take over, allowed the left to win. The left is the enemy. You have allowed the enemy to win the battle. And the only way to stop it is to get rid of this idea of individual autonomy. They say America's public philosophy now puts great stock in, quote, the right to define one's own concept of the mystery of human life. Leaves it to the individual, that's what they're saying. As Justice Anthony Kennedy, the libertarian conservative par excellence. Really? Libertarian? Free market libertarian? Wrote while upholding the constitutional right to abortion. But this vast leeway, notice this vast leeway to discover the meaning of existence extends to destroying the freedom and lives of others. In parentheses, the unborn child in the case of abortion. So notice that what he's saying is the idea that the individual now has a right to define your own concept of morality, of the meaning of life. What that does, if you leave it to the individual, is it destroys freedom. It destroys existence. And indeed, in the left's version, when that is completely subjective and when you allow them to impose it on other people, then yeah, it destroys lives. But they don't separate that. And there's no idea of coercion, the role of government. That never enters the conversation. They go on to write, yes, the old conservative consensus paid lip service to traditional values, but it failed to retard, much less reverse, the eclipse of permanent truths, family stability, communal solidarity, and much else. It surrendered to the pornographization of daily life, to the culture of death, to the cult of competitiveness. These guys are no free marketers. It too often bowed to poisonous and sensuous multiculturalism. So notice the mixture here. Right? We abandoned the permanent truths given to us by God, and family stability, and communal solidarity. So we gave away the collectivism that is at the root of conservatism. The collectivism that is at the root of religion. These conservatives, they gave it away by focusing too much on the individual. I mean, it's a joke that conservatives ever focused on the individual, but anyway. So these conservatives that they're attacking, they have elevated prudential judgments and policies into sacred dogmas. What are the dogmas? These dogmas: free trade on every front. So they're throwing in here free trade is bad. Free movement through every boundary. Immigration is bad. Small government as an end in itself. Limited government is bad. technological advancement as a cure-all. Oh God, let's not have that tech stuff. Let's not embrace technology. And they foreclose on the debate about the nature and purpose of our common life. It's all about the common good. So they declare, this is like a manifesto, we oppose the soulless society of individual affluence. Affluence, individual affluence. Affluence is prosperity, economic prosperity. They're against economic growth. They're against economic prosperity if it's individual. Our society must not prioritize the needs of the childless, the healthy, and the intellectually competitive. Whoa. Notice the altruism. This is the Christian altruism. For those of you who believe that altruism has no impact, here's the Christian altruism full force. Our society must not prioritize the needs of the childless, the healthy, and the intellectually competitive. Our policy must accommodate the messy demands of authentic human attachments, the collectivism, family, faith, and the political community. We welcome allies who oppose dehumanizing attempts at liberation, such as pornography, designer babies, rooms for rent, and severing the link between sex and gender. I mean, mixture here of things that, yeah, okay, and things that, what are they talking about? But what they're expressing is their antagonism to capitalism, their antagonism to individualism, their antagonism to technology, their antagonism to freedom. They write, we stand with the American citizen. Citizen's an important word. We oppose attempts to displace American citizens. Now, what does that displace American citizens stand for? What does displace American citizens mean? It means we don't want those brown people coming over here and replacing us. We don't want immigrants coming here and replacing us. But American citizen doesn't mean all citizens. What about those godless people? Oh, they don't count. And one senses now, notice that, the guy who wrote this, or one of the lead writers of it, he's an immigrant. His name is Ahmari. Ahmari, whoa, it disappeared on me, but it's somewhere here. Where's Ahmari? Sohrab Ahmari. Sohrab Ahmari. So he's from some South Asian country. He's a Catholic. But the language of displacing Americans is a language of racism. It is the language of displacing American citizens is a language of xenophobia. This is the language, unfortunately, of the conservative movement in the age of Donald Trump. We reject attempts to compromise in human dignity. Right? What does that mean? That means we will fight to the death on the abortion issue, and we will use any tactic necessary to win on the abortion issue. And we oppose the transhumanist project of radical self-identification. What's that got to do with transhumanism? I have no idea. We resist a tyrannical liberalism. And here they don't mean liberalism as the left. Liberalism is individualism. Oh, Sohrab Ahmari is Persian. You're right, Persian. But Persian Christian, obviously Catholic, or he's converted to Catholicism, whatever. Here's, for those of you who care about economic liberty, here's what they have to write about this. The Republican Party has for too long held investors and, quote, job creators above workers and citizens. So investors and job creators are not citizens? That's kind of interesting. Again, investors and job creators are not citizens. It's time that conservatives heed the cries of the working class as much as the demands of capital. they sound a little bit like socialists. Maybe they sound like National Socialists. Not Nazis. I'm not claiming they're Nazis. But these are nationalists who advocate for, who use the terminology of socialists. A question on the Super Chat. So are today's American religious conservatives like the 30s fascists? Yeah, that's what they sound like. And you'll get more in a few minutes. That's what they sound like. We believe home matters. And listen to this. For those who enjoy the upsides, a borderless world brings intoxicating new liberties. They can go anywhere, work anywhere. They can call themselves citizens of the world. But the jet setter's vision clashes with the human need for a common life. As a jet setter myself, really? And it has bred resentments that are only beginning to surface. And are these resentments rational? Not rational? Justified? Unjustified? It doesn't matter. It's resentments by the citizens, by the working class, by the people who matter, by the proletariat. We embrace the new nationalism insofar as it stands against the utopian ideal of a borderless world that in practice leads to universal tyranny. False dichotomy. Nobody's advocating, or nobody on the right, as far as I know, is advocating, including me, for a borderless world. Nobody. Jim is asking, a Tea Party movement was interesting at first, and then it was snatched by the Republican mainstream. I mean, I've talked about this in the past. Yeah, I mean, the Tea Party was focused on economic freedom. It was focused on the Constitution, but it was non-intellectual. And it was captured by people like this. It was captured by the mainstream Republicans, but really it was captured by mainstream conservative intellectuals, primarily these kind of people. And ultimately, the Tea Party became the main source of support for Donald Trump. So the Tea Party could never remove itself from religion. It could never remove itself from big government when the big government programs were supporting it. It could never actually turn into a movement to resurrect the spirit of the Founding Fathers, which I had hoped it would. All right, so that I was quoting from this manifesto was published in First Things a few months ago, and it was a bunch of youngish, mostly Roman Catholic writers, and it didn't get a lot of attention, I don't think. Now I don't follow these things, but it didn't seem to get a lot of attention. But then 3 weeks ago, I think about 3 weeks ago, Sohrab Ahmari, a rising star in the youngish Roman Catholic intellectuals of the right, wrote an article in First Things attacking David French. Now, I have to admit, I didn't know who Sohrab Ahmari was, and I only vaguely knew who David French was. But David French is a leading writer in the National Review and a leading kind of conventional, what's considered conventional conservative out there. And in this piece, he basically attacks David French for a few things. One, for using reason in his arguments, for fighting like a gentleman, for trying to use arguments, for trying to convince people, for trying to change the culture. Right? And so he attacks him viscerally around that. Right? He says, though culturally conservative, French is a political liberal, which means that individual autonomy is his lodestar. Again, individual autonomy is what they really, really hate. He sees, quote, protecting individual liberty as the main, if not the sole, purpose of government. Oh my God, if only that were true. If only there were conservatives who viewed the sole purpose of government protecting individual liberty, we would be living in a different world today. So if only French and the standard conservatives were what these people pretend that they are. And of course, he conflates the left with individualism, which it is not. It is not. He goes on to attack David French and to attack this idea of conservative liberalism, and that it is basically folded, that it is dead, and that the only way to win is to embrace Donald Trump tactics. The only way to win is to smash the left. The only way to win is to use government to break up Silicon Valley companies. It's to use government to silence the left at every opportunity we have. It's to use government to impose the conservative social ideas on the American people. Not convince, but impose. He says it's ridiculous that these conservatives think that Silicon Valley should voluntarily adopt First Amendment norms. No, we should force them to adopt the norms we view as right. And throughout political life, we should use the state wherever we can to impose our will. And that means a significant rollback of capitalism, a significant rollback of free markets. You know, this is Tucker Carlson. I don't know if you've seen the video endorsing basically Elizabeth Warren, right? Tucker Carlson is in this wing, the nationalist wing of the conservative movement, populist, nationalist wing of the, but these are intellectuals, right? He says, he writes, this, I mean, I hope you laugh at this, but it's kind of funny. Government intervention will not be the answer to every social ill. Wow. These are conservatives. These are the people tell me all the time we should be working with. These are the people tell me all the time I should be supporting and I should be helping and I should be embracing. Because, hey, they're not the left. They're not the left. So we should help conservatives. We should support conservatives. This is what they stand for. Government intervention will not be the answer to every social ill. In many instances, which they will decide, free markets and individual enterprise can best serve the common good, albeit indirectly, right? No, because you can't have free markets actually serving the so-called common good directly. It happens indirectly. Now notice, what is the difference between that sentence and between Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders? Nothing. The only difference is in how they define the common good and how they define social ills. And you know what? In many respects, I'm more sympathetic to the left's definition of social ills. Because these guys' definition of social ills is gay marriage, which I support. These guys' definition of social ills is abortion, which I support. These guys' definition of social ills are people making choices for themselves, which I support. Their definition of social ills is Silicon Valley companies deciding for themselves who to post and who not to post, which I support. Their definition of social ills is, oh, I had one more and it's gone, right? Oh, pornography. They would make pornography illegal. Pornography, I support. So their definition of social ills are not in the realm of economics. They're not in the realm of liberty. They're not in the realm of freeing us up. They're in the realm of restricting us, bounding us. These are the intellectuals that are supporting Donald Trump. These are the intellectuals that believe Donald Trump is a flawed Messiah, a person leading them to achieve their goals. He's a flawed individual. We are all flawed after all. We're all sinners. But he is shattering convention, and he is going to bring us to where we need to be. And he says, Trump's instinct has been to shift the cultural and political mix ever so slightly away from autonomy above all towards order, continuity, and social cohesion. I mean, that's a joke on so many levels, but is that a good thing? Do we want more order? Do we want more social cohesion in the sense that these guys mean? He believes that the political community, and not just the church, family, and individual, has its own legitimate scope of action. Pretty big. He believes it can help protect the citizen from transnational forces beyond his control. He goes on to say, civility and decency are secondary virtues. Civility and decency are secondary virtues. They regulate compliance with an established order and orthodoxy. We should seek to use these values to enforce our order and our orthodoxy. Not pretend that they could ever be neutral. To recognize that enmity is real is its own kind of moral duty. So this is a battle cry. Both of these documents are battle cries. To abandon civility, which really means abandon reason. Certainly abandon individualism. Abandon the idea of individual autonomy. Abandon capitalism. Abandon economic freedom. To fight for what? For Christian conservative authoritarian state or semi-authoritarian state that restricts its citizens' freedoms, but protects us from immigrants and protects us from the left. And this is what Donald Trump is leading this country towards, because this is what he's emboldening. This is going to survive beyond him. He might go, who knows, he might go 2 terms, 1 term. He has no philosophy, he has no ideology, he's a complete pragmatist. But his style, his populism, his rhetoric, his attitude, his disrespect for the basic foundations of this country, for the basic ideas that are at the root of this country. That's what will survive, and that will survive in a new conservative movement that is dedicated to destroying the freedoms that we have. Now, one more article I want to read you, and from this side of the debate. This is the first things. This is from a philosopher, Pecknold, Catholic philosopher, of course. He writes, I hope that a new conservative consensus will emerge out of the old. But first, we must put to rest the foolish notion that the common good is a socialist idea, or that its relationship to the highest good is fascist or Leninist. So his idea is we need to embrace the common good. And we need to get away from this individualistic view that the common good is, that's something those fascists and socialists do. No, he says. This is what conservatism is all about. It's about the common good. Now, what is the common good according to conservatism? What is the common good according to It's the highest good. It's the good that is God. It is good that is consistent with the teaching of Christ. It is America's a shining city on a hill, not just from an economic perspective. It's a shiny city on a hill from a moral, religious perspective. We need to reorient our politics around the common good illumined by God. So you get full-fledged Christian theology as the heart, as the root of what needs to emerge as the new conservative order, as the new conservative consensus. I mean, these are what Ayn Rand called the mystics of spirit. And Trump is their Attila. Trump is their thug. Trump is their hammer right now. He says, the deepest political question of the West has always been about this question of political standard. How can we determine what is proper and just for a republic, and by what standard can we judge what counts as a perversion? I don't think that's the deepest political question, but okay. But what his answer is, do we live up to the standards of God? He ends the piece by saying, without God, without the transcendent standard, the capricious whims of human desire will continuously drag us down the metaphysical scale, away from the common good of our country, our homes, our families, and ourselves. Now, he comes out clearly on the side of Sohrab Ahmari, stands by him, supports him. And indeed, many of the people I've seen writing do that. Even this one guy who says, I don't agree with Sohrab Ahmari because I think he's too pessimistic, he's too optimistic. He says the problem is we cannot take political control. We're not going to get there. Now, remember, these are not some crazy, mystical, marginal imams in some mosque or some church in the middle of nowhere. These are people at the heart and at the leadership of the modern conservative movement. These are the people driving the modern conservative movement forward. And indeed, right now as we speak, I would argue, taking it over with the support of people like Tucker Carlson on Fox News, who used to be on the more free market side of the conservative movement and has moved now to this nutty, theocratic, anti-intellectual, anti-reason, and most importantly, anti-individualist part of the conservative movement. And Ben Dominic, who founded the Federalists, and for a while, before Donald Trump got elected, the Federalists looked like a reasonable publication focused on freedom and individual freedom and focused on free markets and a variety of different voices within the conservative movement. And now it has become, again, this vehicle to attack individualism, free markets. Ben Dominic at the Federal actually, he agrees, so he came out in support of Ahmari. And one of the things he mentions is we need to defeat the left at all costs. At all costs. And it's not the left's interest in controlling the economy and regulating our lives and taking over our lives. No. It's the left's individualism. It's the left's stand on gays. It's it's those kind of things that are really pissing them off. That's the Federalists, right? So now, Ahmari wrote this about, David French, and Frenchism he called it, and the essay was called Against David Frenchism. And since then, I don't know, thousands of pages have been written about this. Every conservative blog, every conservative publication, every conservative, intellectual place has come out for or against Ahmari. For against Ahmari. And it's fascinating because the defense of Ahmari is principled, strong, uncompromising. And the defense of French is weak. It's weak. Part of the, so the defense of French, some of the defense of French comes from Reason Magazine, which is trying to argue from a kind of a libertarian perspective, but holding on to those Christian values. French himself defends himself, and he says, look, really, I'm not that weak. We can't abandon classical liberalism. Classical liberalism is how we're going to win the battle for Christian values. But the battle is for Christian values. I thought David French's response was particularly weak. Jonah Goldberg's response was a little bit better. But even there, he is so apologetic. He likes Sohrab or Ahmari. He likes him. He keeps saying how much he likes him. He's a good guy, and his goals are good, and his motivations are good in the world. If Ahmari controlled the world, it wouldn't be that bad of a world. This is Jonah Goldberg, the most libertarian, supposedly, of all conservatives. His main concern is, as others have expressed it, is they can't win. Nobody's going to buy into this. People are not interested in theocracy. They don't want theocracy. I mean, this kind of theocracy might not be that bad, but they don't want theocracy. And he says, look, the left has these ugly tactics. And what these people want to do is mimic the tactics of the left. But that will destroy this country. That'll mean that both parties are anti-individual rights or anti-individualism. That's the one good argument he makes. He says, conceding the idea that the state should impose one faction's conception of virtue on the entirety of the country is only a smart play, in realpolitik terms, he says, if you are sure your faction is the one that gets to call the shots. When your faction is in the minority, with few prospects of becoming the majority, it's tantamount to turning the asylum over to the inmates. Well, again, he's saying, you can't win. It's depressing. It's depressing. And of course, I think he underestimates them. I at the end of the day, I'm going to agree with Leonard Peikoff that this country ultimately will be ruled by a theocratic religious thug from the right who brings us socialism. There's no meaning right, left, doesn't matter. You'll get statism, you'll get government intervention in everything. And that's where we're heading, and Donald Trump is moving us on the path there. All right. Let me just see. So I think Jonah Goldberg does the best of all of them to somehow combat this, but it's very difficult. He can't, because he can't escape the religion, and he can't escape his own biases, particularly with regard to religion and his own. Anyway, he does say, and this is great. He says a healthy society is a heterogeneous one. A rich ecosystem with 1,000 niches where people can find different sources of meaning or identity. This is how he's defending individual autonomy. A sick society is one where people find meaning from a single source, whether they call it the nation or socialism or any other brand names we hang on statism. So he's identifying their other position of statism. Good for Jonah. The bipartisan love affair with statism, whether it's called nationalism or socialism, is simply a modern sounding version of the old Game of Thrones from the past. The only new part is that conservatives, long the heroic defenders of the American founding, are spouting these ideas now. And that is indeed sad, although inevitable, given the inconsistencies, the contradictions inherent in conservatism itself, and described to all of us by Ayn Rand herself. To summarize, it looks like there's a real war going on a civil war within conservatives. I think this was inevitable. The more religiously consistent are latching on to the ideas of nationalism, economic nationalism, anti-immigration nationalism, xenophobic nationalism, in order to try to take over the conservative movement and using the Trump presidency as cover to do so. You know, one wants to defend the David Frenchists, I guess, but they're so weak. They're so pathetic in their response. They're so mealy-mouthed about their defense of capitalism, and certainly about their defense of individualism. Now, Jonah is the best, and some of what he says is good, but it's not great. They can't do it. They're too weak. This is where Buckley, kicking Ayn Rand, not that she would have stayed, but distancing the conservative movement from Ayn Rand is a massive loss to the conservative movement. What they need right now is the ideas of the founded, but the ideas of the founding not through a Christian lens, but through an Enlightenment lens, through an Ayn Rand lens. The ideas of the founding through the ideas of reason and individualism, the ideas of science, the ideas of the Enlightenment that come to their full blossoming in the founding of the United States of America. And until they do that, they cannot win. Until they do that, the conservative movement is going to move more to the nationalist side, more to the authoritarian side, more to the religionist side. And again, I think the idea, I think Trump is a step in that direction, and I think Trump is a step in the direction that Leonard Peikoff predicted, which is an authoritarian state run by religionists from the right, appealing to Marxist ideas of the working class, submerging kind of leftist ideas with religion, and coming from the right, coming from a pro-American nationalism. So a national socialism is where we're heading, guided by Christian values, surrounded by Christian values. And that is the end of America as we know it. And that's where, if we don't reverse course, if we don't find a way to challenge these people, if we don't fight the conservatives, if we don't fight these bastards who are trying to take the founding fathers away from America, try to distance America from the founding principles, if we don't fight them, then it'll be on us when America is lost. If we think they are friends in the fight against the left, then it's on us that America will be lost. The modern conservative movement, as it seems to be arraying itself today, is the inevitable consequence of the conservative movement that Ayn Rand identified in the 60s as dead. And its zombie conservative movement is now turning full-fledged into the theocratic nationalism that they really, really have always implied and now willing to say openly. And now that wing of conservatism dominates. It's always been a zombie movement. And of course, Ayn Rand was also right about the election of Reagan, in a sense that Reagan would bring in religion in to the Republican Party, secure the Republican Party as the religious party. And we're seeing that today. By the way, if you want to read Leonard Peikoff's analysis of this, two books, The Ominous Parallels, but I think the more recent book is more convincing in terms of the actual path the United States will take, and that is the DIM hypothesis, D-I-M hypothesis, D-I-M hypothesis. All right, we've got three questions that I will do quickly, and then we'll call it a night, I think. Thoughts and comparison between Trump and Bernie fans. Both hate trade, immigration, both are collectivists. Are they the same movement? Is conservatism blind patriotism motivated by altruism? Yeah, in many respects, they're the same movement. But I don't think either of them are the same kind of conservatives, because it's not an intellectual movement. This movement is a movement of, both Trump and Bernie, movements of, Marxist, in a sense Marxist, of the importance of the working class above all else. Altruism, the needs of the needy are the primary. And nationalism. Now, Bernie plays down the nationalism, but it's there, particularly when he talks about immigration, when he's not running for president. Trump highlights the nationalism, right? Bernie emphasizes his hatred of the rich. Trump downplays that, but it's there, and you can see it sometimes. For example, when they talked about taxes, Trump was happy to raise taxes on the rich. It was Republicans who held taxes on the rich down, on the rich, down in the, when taxes were cut. Both are ultimately pragmatists. Bernie's not a committed, if you saw Bernie's talk about socialism, he's not a committed socialist. He doesn't know what socialism is. He's a pragmatist. They're both very similar. Now, Bernie is on the left, so he's associated with a certain social movement of the left. Trump is affiliated with evangelicals. He is of the religionist side. Now, you're asking, is conservative blind patriotism motivated by altruism? As you saw, it's not blind patriotism. It's a form of patriotism. It's a form of xenophobic patriotism, which is turning into that. Motivated by altruism, motivated by the common good. That is the, above all, that is the most important thing. The other thing both Trump and Bernie reject, and modern conservatives reject, or these modern conservatives reject, is the idea of individual liberty. The idea of individual matters. So in spite of what Ahmari and these new conservatives claim, the left is not about individual autonomy. You as an individual have no autonomy. You are a member of a group. You are self-identified from birth, in a sense, by the color of your skin, by your gender, or by your lack of gender. And it's all determined by your genes anyway. So you're not a member, you're not an individual expressing your individuality, certainly not by using reason as what makes us human, therefore makes us individuals. You are a member of a group, and you're expressing, what you're expressing is just your feelings as a member of a group. Both the left and the right today are pure collectivists. There is no individualistic strand anymore. There's this tiny little strand among conservatives who try to latch on to individualism while still clinging to religion, which is hard for them. And there's some libertarians clinging on to individualism while clinging on to their subjectivism. Philosophical subjectivism. I'm not talking about economic subjectivism. Philosophical subjectivism, which is hard for them. And then there's us, subjectivists. And in a sense, we are the only voice in the world today fighting for true individualism. It's on us. And this is why it is so goddamn disappointing and so goddamn disgusting that so many objectivists have become fans and rally around this new nationalistic conservatism and view them as an ally. No, they are the enemy. And we're surrounded. Everybody's an enemy. But if we don't fight, who is going to fight? If we don't stand up for individualism, who is going to stand up for individualism? There is literally nobody else to do it. We're it. So don't view the enemy as an ally. There's nothing worse, because you hate the left more. Even if you hate the left more, you've got to recognize you've got to hate the right as well. Only when you hate both of them, I'm not saying equally, but hate them both. I hate them equally. I hate the right more in many respects. Only if you hate them both can you actually fight a proper battle for the soul and the future of this country. Only then can we change the dynamics of politics in this world, of education in this world, of culture in this world. But it might be too late. You know, we might have lost because we have so few allies, and even the people who claim to be on our side are not. They're blinded by hatred of the left, just like these nationalist conservatives are. All right, Daniel asks, I would like to see you debate the famous intellectual debaters of the left like Seneca, Sam Seder, or Destiny. It would have a great impact on the objectivist movement than some unknown professors. I mean, I would like to debate them too, but somebody has to organize the debate, and somebody has to invite them and actually has to put the debate together. I am going to be debating a socialist in September, a relatively well-known, I think, socialist who just wrote the Socialist Manifesto. So I'm going to be debating him on 3 university campuses, maybe 4 university campuses. Elizabeth Warren backed out. Elizabeth Warren chickened out of debating me. 4 days ago, she said no. She said yes, 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 and then 4 days ago she said no. So that's out, but I will be debating this guy, I'll get you the name next time, who wrote the Socialist Manifesto. He's young, he's like 29 years old, he's hip, all the kids love him, so it should be a good debate. But I will try to find ways to debate Senex, Sam Sender, and Destiny. I just don't know how. I just don't know when and who arranges the debate. Somebody has to arrange it. Somebody has to put it together, right? All right. Are not individual rights guaranteed in the U.S. Constitution? If not, what? Yeah, you'd think. But they're not explicit enough. They don't define them clearly enough. And the Supreme Court, for 130 years at least, maybe longer, has basically ignored the idea of individual rights, the proper idea of individual rights, as defending your freedom of action, defending you as an individual in pursuit of your life as you see fit. And the Supreme Court has embraced an interpretation of Constitution which embraces the common good, which involves the common good. So that is where we are in terms of the Constitution. In many respects is irrelevant because the Supreme Court refuses to think of the Constitution properly, and refuses, or can't, because it doesn't have the intellectual firepower, to actually understand what the founders meant when they talked about individual rights. It's really horrible. Even the best conservative judges are terrible on these issues. Jim Canicelli asks a request. Milken and hostile takeovers. Your occasional mentions got me reading. Mind-blowing. This is an untapped topic. I'd love a longer Brook look at the topic. Morality and economics. I've already done it, right? Go look at my stuff, right? So there's a whole course on YouTube for free. It's audio only. That's the one downside, right? Audio only, but you can get it as a podcast on any podcasting app. It's called The Morality of Finance. I think that's what it's called. Let me check. If somebody knows, it's my old course on I think it's The Morality of Finance, financial markets, or the case for finance and financial markets, or something like that, right? That's where I cover this topic in detail, right? And I used to teach a whole class on it. The problem with doing more content here on that is that it's history. Most people who watch YouTube today weren't even born then. They don't know who Michael Milken is. They don't understand hostile takeovers. They don't see the importance of it. I'll try to think of ways to integrate it, but one of the great tragedies of American business today is we don't have hostile takeovers. And one of the, I think, things that Trump would do if you had hostile takeovers is he would block them. Or he would decide which ones are acceptable and which ones are not. All right, so Ryan says, legit comment, this is a real downer, Mr. Brook. Call me Yaron, how about that? End with some optimism. Mondays, it's a Monday. You got to be optimistic, right? Well, it's hard to end on optimism when you're talking about politics, or talking about conservatives, or talking about the intellectual world out there. But, you know, we are a robust and strong movement, and we have the best ideas in the world. We have truth, without a question, on our side. And it's just a matter of time before people see it. And we will get more exposure. We are going to grow. We're putting together more and more. Together more and more content from the Ayn Rand Institute that's going to appeal to wider and wider audiences. more and more introductory content, more and more content that will get people engaged. I will be doing a few things. I think these debates on socialism will be good to increasing my following. But I will be also, there will be something with Ben Shapiro. I can't tell you what. I can't tell you when. Not that far into the future. I don't think he's going to back out. Something's going to happen with Ben. That'll get us massive exposure. So, you know, I'm as optimistic as you can be that we have the right ideas, that we are going to expand the reach of those ideas dramatically. I think the new CEO of the Ayn Rand Institute is excellent at this. He's a tech guy. He knows how to use the web and how to use web properties and technologies to do it. I think our partnership with Dave Rubin is going to continue and expand. We're establishing a partnership with Gloria Alvarez. We're going to do a bunch of stuff with Gloria Alvarez, which I think is going to be exciting and going to increase our exposure even more. You know, we do what we can. We keep on fighting. And you know, you are going to make it one way or the other, right? Somebody said, why don't I debate these people? I mean, putting on a debate like that is a $10,000 to $20,000 project, probably, given how much they charge, right? The left are the most expensive speakers out there. Well, not quite, but you know, if you want us to be super successful, you're gonna have to support us, and we're gonna need gazillions of dollars to do it. And the more money you give me, the more debates I will do. The more money you give me, the more debates I can arrange, I can fund, I can organize. I tried to do a debate at Clemson University on nationalism with Yoram Hazony, who's one of these new conservatives who wants to link religion, nationalism, and link them together. And Trump, he's a big Trump fan. And I was going to debate him. He wrote a new book about the virtues of nationalism. And he wants $20,000 and nobody can afford it. But, you know, if I got enough of a following, and how big of a following I get is up to you to a large extent, because you have to share the content and encourage people to follow. And it's up to the amount of money that you guys support me at, because the more money I have, the more stuff I can actually do, the more stuff I can engage in, and the more stuff I can go out there and fund myself without needing other people to fund. So, it's, you know, it's never enough. There's always more, because we're fighting an uphill battle against forces that are a million times bigger than us, a million times more powerful than us, and millions of people more than us. And we're a small band trying to find them. So be more generous in terms of your support. You can support me still on Patreon, because people won't leave. Still on Patreon, on Subscribestar, and on my own website, yaronbrookshow.com/support. So your support will make it possible for us to expand and reach new audiences. Constantly working on ideas to get to new audiences, and we will keep on working on those ideas until we crack it and we go viral in some way or another. But, you know, our message is hard. Our message is hard. It's the truth. But it's hard, because it's rooted, it's grounded in reason. It requires people to think. And you guys are thinking. So you guys should be proud of yourselves, because you're listening, you're engaged. You might not agree with everything I say, but you're not turning me off because you disagree. You're listening, and you engage with it. And and I think at the end of the day, we win. I don't know when the end of the day is, but at the end of the day, we win. If you comment about Joe Rogan, I'll switch from Patreon to your website tomorrow. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, Joe Rogan won't have me on. That's all I've got to comment on Joe Rogan, right? He won't have me on. I don't know why. People have recommended he have me on, but he just won't contact me. I've emailed him. He won't respond. Daniel says, Destiny debates people for free over Skype, similar to debates with Jesse Lee Peterson. Oh, my God. I don't know. Let me look into Destiny. If they're reasonable, I would do that. Yes. All right. Why don't you approach Destiny and have them approach me and ask me to come on their show to debate them? I'd rather I go on their show than they come on mine. So, and debate that way. So, and you can do that with any of those people. All right. Thanks, everybody. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you enjoyed it. It was a little technical, maybe. I don't know. But scary stuff. And yet, here's the optimism. We will win. And in the meantime, in spite of all these bastards, you get to enjoy life. So go have a good week. I'll talk to you tomorrow, 7, 8, something like that, Eastern time. But I will be back tomorrow, maybe with Amy. I don't know. I'll ask Amy. I'll find out. But we'll be back.